bit more about John, the way he lived, and help us celebrate his life. Thank you. And now, Joe Severson.
On behalf of I wanted to sit. Can I just kind of... Not good, not good. Okay, now this is good. Oh, thank you. Okay, is everybody can hear me okay? Yeah. Back off a little bit. It's gonna work out. So on behalf of the Severson family, can't hear me? Okay. Back up here. On behalf of the Severson family? Okay. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Surfer Magazine. This is just great. So, I've read all of the tributes to John all week, and they're really, really great. If you knew him, you know it's all true. He was an amazing man, so. It's hard to take John and put him on one page or a few paragraphs. Not that easy. He was huge. He was so full of talent. He couldn't wait to do the next thing that popped into his mind. So I just want to start in about 1959. Okay, 1959. John is 26 years old, and he's my high school art teacher. 26 years old. Amazing. He'd already been through college, been in the Army, been in Hawaii. He started taking photos and pictures. His movies were just getting started. So there we are. There's also, he's also in charge of the baseball team, the junior varsity baseball team. He's the coach, and I'm the pitcher. Alan Seymour was on that team. So a little ways into the season, you know, he loved baseball, I love baseball, but surfing was really coming on strong. And John just said, you know, I've got these movies, I've got a lot going. I just can't coach this team anymore. And I said, great, I'm quitting too. So we both quit, and he's, you know, we're doing the movies, and what happens is he gives me a car. Let's start with that. And so that was my gift for quitting with him. And what I'm going to do with this car is I'm going to put up posters up and down the coast when there's a movie to be seen down in this, you know, San Diego, La Jolla, Newport Beach, Redondo Beach. I was taking all of the I'm getting a little tied up here. I would put the posters up in each town. I had a ton of them in a funky staple gun, and I'd put them up, go through town, and then come back the other way. Sometimes they'd be gone before I left town. But like any 16-year-old, I realized that I had too many posters left. So what do, you know? You pull over to a trash can, Throw them in the trash can. All these posters you'd love to have right now. So, but the amazing thing is, even though all those posters didn't get up, there wasn't one of those movies that wasn't just packed. I could have put 3 posters up in each town and they would have been packed. We were so hungry. Here are movies for us, young surfers. John was building a platform, a place where we were validated all of a sudden. So basically, he was a great guy, good brother, and I'm going to miss him. So thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Joe. All right, next is Jeff Gerard here. So Jeff is a longtime friend of John's, and he's going to share a couple words with us. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Todd. I'm going to read because I'm not a great public speaker. So thank you, Todd and Benji and Joe and everyone for asking me to take a minute and share my experiences with John. He was an awesome guy. But when I started in Surfer in 1984, John had already sold a magazine and gone to Maui. So I thought my contact with him would be minimal. And yet his presence was everywhere in the office. His aesthetic and his voice still had traction in the content and the vibe. John felt that a surf magazine could rise above and that their readers would rise with it, and he was true. Many of the talented people that he drafted into the work were still around, and so even though I rarely spoke or saw John, I just felt him all the time. He was there. Fortunately, I was asked to help put together a coffee table book featuring John's story and pictures. So off I went to Maui to work with him, curating his photos and arranging the pages. And you learn a lot about a subject in the course of book building. And John's life and art makes for fascinating content. I loved hearing about his early life in San Clemente with his brothers, Jerry and Jim and Joe, inhabiting the pier zone and walking the beach to trestles to surf. For me, his life of painting and writing and filmmaking seemed idyllic. I know in reality that every life has struggles, but John really had the ability to make life creative and wonderful. So one day while we were making that book, we were taking a break, and I was looking around his studio, and John was commenting on his various artifacts and his artwork and the collections that he had. And I motioned to one painting that was way up on a shelf and told John that I really appreciated the watercolor technique that it displayed. The painting is Lahaina Luna. It's a nocturne with a pale moon rising over the mountains behind Lahaina, and a group of sleepy shacks arrayed along the shoreline. Its simple brushwork demonstrated a mastery of the watercolor process, with some delicately bled hues making a variegated ring around the moon and lighting up the reflections in the water. It's beautiful. And John was, just pleased to have someone appreciate his artwork. So, we worked out all the pages of the book, and my time kind of finished up. Took a few breaks to surf while I was there, and then I returned home. And a few days later, a package arrived from John. And inside was the painting in its original split bamboo frame. And Alan Seymour is, would tell you what a split bamboo frame is like these days. They're hard to come by. And on the back was this inscription: to Jeff, thanks for the support and aloha. Surf on. Aloha, John. What a generous gesture on his part. John was a support and an inspiration for me. Whatever he laid his hand or mind to resulted in something uniquely Sivo. Distinct and signature, whether it was a painting, a story, a film, a typeface. Do you guys know that John did typefaces too? Or even a doodle on your phone pad. Yeah. No signature needed, you knew John had been there. So a year ago, I was in kind of a rough patch. I was pretty down in spirit. And I was on Maui, so I went to see John at his place in Sprecklesville. He was physically compromised by his struggle with the disease, but he was in great spirits. And as usual, he was very encouraging, and he had good words of guidance for me, bigger picture stuff, you know, like don't get mired in the small things, and this too shall pass. Focus on the good that will come from change. You know, that's the kind of stuff you get from your mentor and your guide. And I've always appreciated his input into my life and my creative work. So I pass this back to John. Thanks for the support and the aloha. Surf on. Aloha, Jeff. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Is Hyatt Moore around? Hyatt? So Hyatt's a longtime friend of John's. He was a former art director at Surfer Magazine, and he's going to share some words with us.
I met John in 1969, the end of the 60s, which was an era that many of us remember, I see, by the look of our ages. And we made it through that time somehow. I went to my shelf the other day and came across this book. Well, I looked for it, I knew it was there. It says High Moore on the front. I was known as High Moore in those days. This was the annual of Surfer magazines for that year, 1969. And somewhere I have a box of a bunch of more books. I worked there from 69 through 83 with about a 4-year hiatus when I didn't work there. And John was the one that got me started in many ways. Let me just put this down. I was going to share with you. Whoops, I can't. Some of the great pictures in that magazine, but I only have 2 hands. John gave me a start. I was already an aspiring graphic designer. I remember somebody. Well, it's over it now. Thank you. I just appreciate it. Somebody recommended that I go down there and interview for the job. I brought my wife along thinking I needed all the help I could get. She looked good. My samples were just in a paper bag. I was just getting started. But he saw, I think he told me later, a vitality and a sense of humor, and that's what he was after. So he gave me a try, and I became an art director. It was a great job with great people. Drew Campion had just come on. He was very cutting edge art brewer. Ron Stoner had already kind of passed. Rick Griffin had gone up to San Francisco to become a hippie poster artist. Later on came back with God. Kept changing. Who else? Brad Barrett with his wry sense of everything. Perspective on life. Art Brewer, did I say? Later on, Steve Pesman. It was a great group of people. It was a great job. In those days, it was every 2 months, which meant we could put the magazine together in about a month, and then we had a month off. It was a perfect job. Now, of course, when the surf was up, nobody was in the office. And I was stuck with deadlines, so it wasn't perfect in that regard, but it was great. Lots of fun, lots of humor. It was a youth-oriented magazine, and he wanted to keep it that way. And it came out of John's personality. He had a full-orbed personality, artist has been mentioned many times, and I think an artist, being an artist myself, tends to see things different than the non-artist and sees other things, and he would bring that in. So it wasn't that he painted, although he did. In his house he had a studio. I wasn't painting in those days, so I didn't particularly relate to it. That's what I do now. But he was a great doodler. In fact, as somebody mentioned, every place he went, he'd leave doodles behind. One time he offered a number of his friends that were over at his house to take any piece of artwork as a gift that we could have. Well, I took one of his posters with doodle, not one of these surf posters, one of the ones full of doodles of his high school friends, because it was just so great. He said, well, I don't know if I'm going to part with that, but those are my friends. I said, well, it's what I want. So I got it. Wish I knew where it was now, but okay. John kept trying things. He would try new kinds of paper, or a fold-out, or anything that was sort of cutting edge. It was like, even though there's really no competition to speak of, well, Surfing Magazine was kind of coming along, but we didn't take them too seriously yet. But he was pushing it all the time in any case. Didn't matter if there was no competition. He just wanted to keep on going, keep pushing it. We all came up with ideas. It's actually kind of a small staff that put it together. The editor, the photo editor, the art director, and the publisher, in John's case, and later in Steve's case. We'd kind of sit around a light table and talk about how this article could go. Get all the photos together, get the words together, see how many pages you got for that one, and just move on. Take it home, work on it. I work on it at home. Sometimes it was great stuff, sometimes it wasn't so great. One of our expressions was making chicken soup out of chicken shit. We didn't have much to work on, but we still had to make it look good. And we did. It was a quality magazine. One of my contributions was the first annual End of the World Day. Just a lot of creativity. And then we made Motor Skill. That was another idea of John's. The picture's right here. I think that's taken to the ranch, because I know the day we were painting it, it wasn't cold. We weren't wearing coats, so I think that was up when he was shooting, probably for Pacific Vibrations. That was an interesting period. Preface to that was another interesting period, let me just come back, is the Nixon years. Some of you know that Dick Nixon moved into a prestigious neighbor, John Severson. John was quite convinced that his house was bugged. Every now and then we'd be visiting over there and he'd yell out, "You hear that, Dick?" Or, "You want a toke, Dick?" "Oh, never mind, Dick." Well, nothing, we don't know if anything came of that, but it was on his mind that he might be bugged right there at his own house. An interesting time. And it was a time that he was kind of going a direction that Dick Nixon wouldn't have approved of. Pacific Vibrations, I think, was a major turning point for him. I know we just saw him less at the magazine. He was up in Hollywood. Of course, he was a filmmaker before he was ever a magazine maker. But it seemed, and I may be off on this, but I'm going to say it anyway, it's my conjecture, that during that time he was, I think, wanting to make a big splash and was influenced by Hollywood. He went to Hollywood and spent a lot of his time there. And I think was overdoing it? I don't know. All I know is that when he rented a big-time theater for the opening and brought all the surfers in the world that would come, and they did, nobody clapped. In the old days, everybody hooted all the way through a surf movie. Well, it was like maybe too polished or something. And in the end, people thought, well, we've seen a movie, and you don't usually clap at movies. But John expected it, and it didn't happen. And I think it hurt him. And it was probably one of the things that convinced him that it's time to move on. And he began to look for somebody to buy the magazine and move on to Hawaii, which was a deeper goal in any case, I think, in him. and just live the rest of his life in a different way. During that time, he was looking for who would take his place. And he looked all around. He looked at some of the large industries in the surfing world. In those days, it was the large industries were clothing manufacturers. And he looked for some of those guys who were entrepreneurial types, but they were very busy. And they had a successful life. So John wasn't finding, he even looked at me once. And I said, don't look at me. I said, look at Steve Pesman. Well, he hadn't. Steve was there, but he hadn't thought of Steve. But he started to. And then later on said, he's right here. Why did I do all that searching? That was the best answer. And it was, as time has proved, that was the wisdom of that decision. Steve has done a tremendous job ever since. John was also what's the word I want? It's sort of been said, gracious and polite, even though he had kind of a hard, not hard, but competitive edge also. But I remember he hired his family. I thought, what is his dad doing here? He seems so staid and out of place, but it was his dad. And then Joe showed up. He's kind of spaced. You were in those days. But you could handle the trash cans. And John just gave his family a job. And he was generous that way. He had a good reputation in the community. I remember one time I called for reservations at Tortilla Flats or something, because we often went out to dinner. We had a big group. And they just said, we have no room, we're completely filled up. John says, tell him John. Tell him John's calling. I said, it's John Severson. They said, oh, we have room. Okay, I thought that was pretty impressive. Well, I rather lost track of John. Not long after he had moved to Hawaii, he wrote me. I was living in Guatemala at that time with my whole new life. He said, come over here, we can do some creative things. I was too started to my next life myself, but it was a compliment, to be honest. In fact, there was a time when his wife and my wife and the two of us considered very seriously of going to Papua New Guinea, I did go there later, to New Zealand and live there. Just get away from all this and go down there and live more relaxed. It was very serious. It didn't last, but that was how we were and how we thought we would like to live. Well, now he's gone ahead of us. He's found out because of his death, his age, that he's 10 years ahead of me. Well, that's not that far. Here we are with our gray hair and our bad backs. But what John has just gone through and gone into is about to come for us. I don't know what to say about that. None of us know what to say about it, except for the fact that we are mortal. And our time comes, we hope we can leave as good a reputation behind us as John Severson has. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hyatt. So it's kind of a perfect segue hearing about the old days of Surfer to bring up our next speaker, Steve Pesman, former publisher of Surfer Magazine.
Thank you. Gee, Hyatt, that was great. Hyatt's had a lot of practice at public speaking in this last third or half of his life, and he's a great, thoughtful painter of pictures with words as well as graphically. I don't know how to organize myself or to be cohesive in my comments, so I thought I'd just share things that come to my mind. I didn't know John. I knew who he was. I was like a typical surfer. I stole the poster for the first Surfer magazine and Goldie surfboards off the wall. I was a Seal Beach, Huntington guy, Seal Beach at the time, and grew up in Naples and Surf Ray Bay, and So John had gone to Long Beach State and lived in Seal Beach for a while with Blackie August on the Blackie's oceanfront home, 13th Street, rented a room or in the back or something. And one of his early paintings is of a group of surf characters standing on the beach at 13th Street with one guy's wearing a slouch hat, and they're in coats and various garb, and it was a portrait of attitude. And it was rendered in a rather modern panel, color interesting, not representative color in all instances, very creative choice of the way he did things. The first surfer booklet that he put out, called The Surfer, I believe, it was made up of frame grabs from his movies to advertise the movie that was coming out, maybe Surf Safari or Surf Fever, I can't remember which one. But in it was a fiction piece called Malibu Lizards. And in that piece, there's not a wave ridden. It's about the surf culture, and he discovered it. It had been published in a UC Santa Barbara literary journal. And it was a student piece, I guess, or an instructor piece. And that piece, in later years, I began to realize reflected a lot about how John expressed the world of surfing. It was about the culture, the experience of being a surfer in a world that didn't understand you, of having a different drum to march to than the rest of the world, and feeling like the rest of the world was occupied with SOP kind of procedure, and yet we realized that there was something else that was important and rhythmic and spiritual that could be a life course. And it was completely foreign to our parents. Our parents were children of the Depression, and they were taught to be secure, and surfers are giving up security for experience. So John took the magazine, used the magazine to express himself, and in the process, he intellectualized the sport to a certain extent, not to a scholarly way, but his selection of articles and topics and the way he portrayed surfing had a certain intellectual edge to it that I think influenced the sport to expand in that direction as well as the rest of it. And without that influence, I think the sport might have been lesser in its entirety. And I think John's modes of expression, his artwork, his writing, his publishing, his films, were all had a kind of a non-derivative feeling to them. Most surf art, looks like a copy of Rick Griffin Murphy or a this or a that, but if you look at John's work, it doesn't look like anyone else's. And that's saying something. That's to be non-derivative in a creative way is really a wonderful thing. And he had a huge influence in that sense. And if you think about it, really all he painted that I know of was surf culture throughout his whole life. It was surf vehicles rounding the point with big waves. It was surfers dropping in on big waves. It was surfers standing on the beach, boards spread out on the sand. All the graphics, all the images that he portrayed. He found a way to explain life within that certain culture, and he immersed in it deeply, and was completely satisfied with it as a format for him to express himself. So he was such a different kind of person. I didn't know John, we all figured Joel was a better surfer. And because Joel was a little bit younger and more contemporary and kind of a hotter surfer, and John surfed in a more smooth, elegant kind of way. Had his own style, and so they were both, in a sense, both equals as surfers. But that was just our kind of snide vision at the time. I remember because we'd see John at Lower Trestles, and he surfed well, you know, and he surfed out in front of his house on Maui, and I remember when I was working there, he took me. They asked me how much I was. I had been working at Surfing Magazine, and it folded, and so I went down to Surfer looking to be a contributor, freelancer, and they asked me how much I'd been making at Surfing. I said 600, and they said, "Well, how about coming to work for us? Drew Campion is having a salary dispute with John over $100 a month and leaving. And so John's going to take over the editorship, but he wants someone to do the dog work, you know, editing, proofreading, writing captions, and he needs someone, so how about coming on board and doing that?" And I said, "Wow, yeah, that was more than I expected, more than I hoped for." And so one day he asked me, "Hey, I'm leaving." Pardon me? How much? How much did I go to work for? Less than I'm worth. When he asked me how much I was making at my prior job, I lied and told him more than I was, so that when he cut me down $100, it was more than I'd been making there anyway. So John asked me who I thought would be a good publisher. He had sold the magazine before I went to work there, but I didn't know it. And he had an earn-out period that was maybe a year or two. I don't know what the conditions of it were. And so when I went to work there, he was finishing Pacific Vibrations and completing this earn-out period. But one of the Secret Service guys at the Western White House was dating John's sister, and he told her that this is the story I heard. He told her that your brother better watch his step. We know everything that's going on in that house. And John decided to move immediately. I mean, that was just too much, because he had a little paranoia in him anyway about things, and that just tipped the bucket. And so he asked me who would be a good publisher, and I said, well, maybe Dick Graham, my old publisher at Surfing. So he contacted Dick, and Dick had just started a business and said, nah, thanks for offering, but no. So then he went to Tom Morey and asked Tom if he wanted to be the publisher. Now you can imagine what Tom Morey would be like as a publisher of Surfer Magazine. But brilliant, but not a publisher, not a businessman, you know. So, pardon me?
Easy now.
Oh, no. No, Tom, you're brilliant, but you're not a bookkeeper. So one day he asked me to go to lunch, and I'd never heard the story that Hyatt shared about Hyatt suggesting me. Thank you, Hyatt. But so I'm riding in the car with him to the Colony Kitchen at Ortega Highway and the freeway, and he looks at me and says, well, I guess you're it. And I went, huh, I'm what? And he said, how would you like to be publisher of Surfer? And I was looking at him stunned. And he said, hey, don't worry about it. You edit for 3 hours a day, publish for 2 hours a day, go surfing. He said, keep the job for a couple of years, it'll be good for you. So I ended up keeping it for 21 years. I was white-knuckled to the job. But, so anyway, through the years, John and I stayed in touch, and he complimented me on the journal, and I think he was flattered by the fact that we continued on in his spirit. And but he had what surfing is today, the soul of surfing, not the sport, not the athleticism, not the commercial side of it, but the soul of surfing. John was largely the architect of, as far as spreading that side, popularizing that side, and making that side known to the surfers that came along as a value thing in the experience. So he lent a huge dimension to the sport that we can never thank him enough for. And I guess I better stop. Thank you.
All right, now we're going to have one of John's longtime friends, Corky Smith, come up and say a few words. Thanks, Corky.
Well, my experience with Surfer Magazine, I met John the first time surfing at the Trestle, and then I didn't see him again for another 3 or 4 years. And my concept of Surfing Magazine when I worked there in the 60s was the Magical Mystery Tour. The people he had working for him at the time when I was there was Rick Griffin and Ron Stoner, Bill Ogden, and a very eclectic group of people. And what John had me do was working for Don Thomas in advertising. I knew nothing about advertising. And he said, what you're going to do is take your car and you're going to drive up and down the coast and you're going to get ads from everybody. And I'm going, what? He said, drive all the way to Santa Cruz and then come back and go to San Diego. And so this went on for 3 or 4 years. And the interesting part of the whole thing is that I'd seen a lot of these people when I was surfing up and down the coast, but the ironic part of the whole deal was that they were all jealous of whose ad was going to get in first. Hobie wanted to be in before Velzy, and Dewey wanted to be in before Jacobs, and this went on and on and on like this. And then what happened was that John, through Don Thomas, were doing a bunch of ads up in Hollywood. And for some reason, I was fortunate enough to get in 1965, and Tom Morey was there. We did an ad for Chevrolet that went all across the United States, and I had no idea what was going on. And John said to me, I came back from Hollywood, and he goes, what happened? I said, I don't know, I was up there for 4 days. He said, don't sign anything. Don't sign any papers. And I went, well, why? He said, residuals. I didn't know what residuals were. And unbeknownst to me, every time this thing showed, I got a check. And this went on and on and on. And then fast forward a few more years when I was going to grad school and stuff like that, and John got a hold of me and found out what I was trying to do in Laguna Canyon with a Native American thing, and he offered to draw some maps for me. Ogden was going to do some pictographs for me. And what I'm trying to say here is that it's kind of sad in a way for me, is that you have an individual that did a lot for you from the sidelines, and I never really had a chance to say thank you. And it's kind of sad for me to come to a situation like this and see a lot of people here that knew John. And I don't know if you feel like I do, but God, I wish I would have said more when he was here than I did then. And thank you very much.
And next we have another member of the Surfer family coming up here, former editor-in-chief Jim Kempton.
Thank you, Todd. I'll keep mine really brief, but one thing that I think John would have liked everyone to know, and that is so true about him, is along with all of the great things that he did for surfing and the culture, the great artist that he was, and how he influenced all of our lives, he was also a great family man. He had a wonderful marriage, he had fabulous kids, And if you know his kids or his wife or his grandkids, you know that they all turned out amazing. And they've done so many things of their own. And I think that despite all the rest of this, when it's all said and done, what you have with your children and what you leave to them and what they're like, that's probably the greatest statement you can make about yourself, that you leave as a legacy. And John left a great one there. So just wanted to mention that. Todd thinks I'm still talking.
All right, and now we're going to have another Surfer family member, Sam George, former editor-in-chief. Thanks, Sam.
I was on a surf trip in Costa Rica when, of course, in the connected world now, everyone knows everything, but I was on a surf trip in Costa Rica when I heard that John had passed away, and I thought that was perfectly as it should be, considering he was the architect of my entire life, basically. My whole life up to when I eventually became the editor of Surfer, and then all the years since then. And when I got home, I read the obituary that they ran in the LA Times, and they quoted me in that obituary. And like a lot of newspaper articles, they just took a sentence out of a much broader statement. And they had me saying something like, there was no surf media before John Severson. And what that was just a snippet from a broader paragraph that I had written about John and his contribution. And what I was saying was that, yes, there was plenty of surf media. I mean, you had Tom Blake back in the 30s. You had Bud Brown, in the early 50s. And you had all those great filmmakers like Bruce Brown and Greg Knoll and John Severson in the 50s. But it wasn't until he created Surfer Magazine that what I consider the real surf media began, because before then, those movies, they were flickering images, in high school auditoriums up and down the coast, and they were as ephemeral as the summer surf. They came, they went. But by creating Surfer Magazine, he created something that you could hold and you could read and you could discuss and you could pass on. And, what I said in that broader statement is that, in a sense, he created a mirror that he held up for all of us to look at and see our own image. And it's kind of appropriate when I showed up here, because the cover to my right was what I was discussing in that paragraph. And I said, look at that image in this paragraph I wrote. Look at the image. Look at everything that says about our surf culture. And here's how I interpret it. Those guys are warming up after an early morning session. That's not late afternoon. That's 10 o'clock, probably. There's no one else around. That means it's 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. That means everyone else is at work or they're at school. But those guys are laying around warming up after a morning session at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday. And I said, that really makes such a powerful statement about what Steve and all the other guys up here were talking about, how John had this vision of surf culture, more than just being a sportsman. It was something that you did as opposed to doing something else. It was an actual way of life. And that's why when I was discussing, in that sentence where I said that he really created the surf media, is because he created the media that basically shaped most of our lives as I'm looking out here today. But along with that cover, I also mentioned the very first issue of The Surfer that he put out. And the fact that in that very same issue, which really, as Steve explained, it was frame grabs promoting a movie. But in there, at the very last spread, he ran that page, which is just to my left there, of a guy paddling out on a really clean morning day at Hammond's Reef. And he wrote the single most influential words that have ever been written about surfing. And he wrote, in this crowded world, the surfer can still seek and find the perfect day, the perfect wave, and be alone with the surf and his thoughts. And looking out at all of us here, it really made me think that all those perfect days that we've all shared, look how they've shaped the way we think, our families, the way we look, the way we dress. all those perfect days that statement inspired. And it made me realize that today, on an occasion like this, today is not a sad day. Today is another one of those perfect days. The perfect day of so many perfect days that obviously, look at us, that we've obviously all shared. And for all those perfect days that we've had and all the perfect days to come and today's perfect day, we have John to thank. And that's just really what this really means to me, and I'm sure it means to all of us. And just like Hyatt said, or just like Corky said, thank you, John.
All right, now we're gonna have Gordon McCullum come up. He's a longtime friend of John's, and he was his agent for his artwork.
Okay, I wasn't planning to do this, so I'll be brief. I think that really the way I met John was really pretty much the way that our friendship went after that time. And it was in the early 1970s. Griffin was constantly telling me about this great John Severson. Of course, I knew growing up in the surfing culture, he was sort of this legendary surf filmmaker and magazine, with Surfer Magazine and everything. And I would see him over at Surfer Magazine, but never really talked to him much. And so Rick kept saying, listen, this guy was the most influential guy on my early career, and I probably wouldn't have been doing what I was doing if it